Hi, everyone. So this is Chapter 9, Communication and Relational Dynamics. So as you know by now, I like to begin my lectures with a quote. And the quote for this chapter is, if you carry the bricks from your past relationships to the new one, you will build the same house. And I'd like you to just think about that for a moment. So if you carry the bricks from your past relationships to the new one, you will build the same house. And what that is essentially saying is that if we don't learn the communication tools and we don't learn the communication strategies and we haven't learned from our past relationships, that we are going to create the same types of relationships that we created before. So it may be a different person, but it will probably be the same pattern or the same experience. So this chapter is really all about building your communication tool kit, if you will, and also helping you to understand some of the strategies that are going to help you to form and maintain and enhance healthier relationships in your life. So we're going to cover a lot today. I will try to simplify things as much as possible and to limit the talking as much as possible because I do understand this is a very long chapter. The preview for today's lecture is number 1, factors that influence your choice of relational partners. Then we will go over Knapp's model for relational stages. And then we'll be talking about dialectical tensions. How do we manage those tensions in our relationships? Changing culture in interpersonal relationships. Metacommunication, that is communication about communication, and the steps that are necessary to maintain support and repair interpersonal relationships. So moving on to our first main idea, why do we form relationships? Well, there are a series of factors that influence our choice of relational partners, and the first one is appearance, not surprisingly. So we are attracted to physically attractive people. That is a given. And in many research studies, and the one that was noted in your textbook, there was a study of 700 people. They went on a blind date, and they decided that they wanted to go on a second date with the person that they found physically attractive. Those that didn't find the person physically attractive, they didn't want to go on the second date. So we do know that appearance attracts us to people. However, appearance does not keep us attracted to people. So it may allow some doors to be opened for individuals, but it does not necessarily mean that those doors will remain open. The second one is similarity. So similarity is important. We are attracted to people that are like us. Why? Well, because they confirm and help to reaffirm our beliefs and our perspectives. The things that we enjoy, they enjoy. Our political beliefs, our religious beliefs. So when people are similar to us, we have a tendency to like them more because they reaffirm who we are as a person, and they also reaffirm how we see ourselves. So they kind of serve as an ego support. So they support our ego because they think like we do. So similarity is one thing, but also we are attracted to people based on how complementary the relationship is. So probably haven't seen the movie, but there's a movie called Jerry Maguire, and he said, "You complete me." And what he meant by that was that they, in the relationship, they complemented each other. So what her strengths were, his were not, and what his strengths were, hers were not. So in a complementary relationship, it can be very satisfying because let's say you're not so good with finances, but this other person is, and then you might come together. Or maybe you're a little bit more shy and you're attracted to a person to be their friend because they're more outgoing and they can pull you out of your shell. So the complementary aspect of individuals is one of the things that does influence how attracted we might become to them or we are to them. Some of the differences, though, can strengthen our relationships. Again, you complete me, but some of the differences, if they're too great, can also strain our relationship. So for example, if there's a distribution of control and it's disrupted in some way or it's unequal, then that can actually strain the relationship that we have with someone. And then the fourth factor is reciprocal attraction. So a person who is attracted to us, we are more likely to be attracted to. because when they like us, we have a tendency to like them. And part of that is that they confirm our presenting self, and then they like who we present ourselves to be, and we have a tendency to like that. So there's that reciprocity in the relationship, which will make you more likely to be attracted to that person. And again, when we're talking about attraction, it could be with regards to a friend, or it could be with regards to a supervisor or a boss, colleague. It could also be a romantic attraction as well, or a family member. And then moving on to our next slide, competence. We are attracted to competent people. We are attracted to people that also are interpersonally warm and competent. And it's good if they're competent because we're hoping that it will rub off on us. But if they are too competent, then we sometimes get insecure and we don't want to be standing next to them. So competent is good. Too competent, and sometimes it might spike some insecurity within you. With regards to competence, like I said, we are more attracted to people that are competent but warm, as opposed to competent but aloof or cool. So competence is also another factor. And the next one is disclosure. We've talked about self-disclosure before in previous chapters when we talked about the Johari window, but disclosure is also a factor for attraction, or what will influence our choice of relational partners. In self-disclosure, the more we self-disclose, the more we reveal about ourselves, it can help to build liking, and it can help to build the relationship that you have with the other person. But there are a few things that are key to the self-disclosure. Number one, there has to be reciprocity. Cat right here. So number one, there has to be reciprocity, and that means it's a give and take. So you self-disclose and they self-disclose. It can't just be you self-disclosing all the time, because that's not a factor that does influence one of our choices in relational partners. But also what is key is that timing. So it's really important that we don't self-disclose too much too quickly in a relationship. So timing is really important. Know when to say something and know when to hold back and not to say something. One thing that I want you to remember is that is key about disclosure is that you want to make sure that people that you self-disclose to, that they earn your trust, and that you don't just self-disclose and assume that they are trustworthy, because that would be a mistake. This is especially true in the world of online dating. Oftentimes people will self-disclose really early on in the dating process, and you haven't gotten a chance to fully understand or fully know the person, and they probably haven't really earned your trust to totally self-disclose things that are important to you. So that's something to keep in mind when you are if you happen to date online. But just in general, when you self-disclose, you want to be thinking about, is this person trustworthy enough to hear what I have to say about this personal information? And moving on to proximity. Proximity is another factor in one of the reasons why we choose our relational partners. So what's interesting with proximity, sometimes colleagues might get together because they are working closely together. Or perhaps your neighbor next door has a dog and you have a dog too, and you decide to walk your dogs together, so you become friends. So when you're in close proximity to people, that's going to influence who you choose to be your friend, who you choose to be your romantic partner. And then rewards. There is a theory called social exchange theory. You have to have rewards, and that is an influence when you're choosing a relational partner. So sometimes you might wonder, well, why would that person be with that person? Well, there has to be a reward. And in social exchange theory, what it states is that it's a theory that explains why we form and maintain relationships. And it says there has to be a greater number of rewards to cost, and then that will equal the outcome, which will cause you to decide, do I keep this relationship, stay with this relationship, or do I leave? And we do this often unconsciously. So think about it like this. You have a friend, and you've had this friend since you were 5 years old, and now you're at SCF and you're both 25 years old. And you can't really get deep with this friend, but you are able to do fun things with this friend, and you're able to study with this friend. So you have a decent friendship. Now, you've graduated from SCF and your friend got a job in Bradenton and decided to stay in Bradenton, and you decided to go on to a university in California and continue your education. So now, are the rewards for maintaining that relationship greater or not? And so those are some of the things that you're going to take into consideration. So you might decide that you're not going to text this person all the time because you may not have as much in common anymore. And because you didn't really talk before, you're really not going to talk now. Before you used to do things together, now you live thousands of miles apart. So you might still maintain the friendship on Facebook, but you may not text that person as often anymore. And that's called the social exchange theory. When the cost outweigh the rewards, you decide to either terminate that relationship or maybe put it on the back burner. And when the rewards outweigh the cost, you decide to keep the relationship and to maintain it. So it's an interesting perspective on relationships. Now, moving on to our models of relational dynamics. This is a developmental perspective, and it's based on different stages that we go through in our relationships. And for just the point of example, I'm going to use romantic relationships as the example for the 10 stages of development in relationships. This is Knapp's model. Okay, so what you have to understand is that according to Knapp, the communication that we engage in is going to be different in each stage. So the very first stage is when you see a person and that you're possibly interested in that person. So you just want to get their attention. You want to initiate perhaps a conversation or make eye contact with that person, or maybe ask that person a question. So you're initiating something with that person. And then let's say there was a reciprocal gesture or perhaps glance, and you think, well, maybe this person likes me, or maybe the person said, hey, you might call me sometime and then we can study together. And then you think, oh, okay, well, maybe I will. So that brings you to the experimenting stage. And in the experimenting stage, that's when you start to ask more questions. That's when you want to get to know the person a little bit better, try to see if you have things in common. There's another theory called uncertainty reduction theory. And in uncertainty reduction theory, we ask questions so that we can make predictions about future behavior. So basically, we ask questions so that we can determine if we would want to continue a relationship with this person, if we're interested or if we're not interested. Do we have things in common or do we not have things in common? So the next stage is the intensifying stage. And in the intensifying stage, it's exactly what it states. You are in that state of euphoria, you're giddy, and you're just on cloud nine, you're daydreaming about this person all the time. If the entire world were in this stage of relationship development at the same time, everything would come to a stop, would come to a complete halt. So it's that stage where you just have the butterflies in your belly when you see that person. You can't stop thinking about them, and it's the really fun, exciting part of relational development. And then moving on to integrating. And integrating, you start seeing yourself as not just an individual person, but you see yourself more as a couple. And then you see yourself more as we instead of I or mine. It's we and it's us. And then moving on to that bonding stage. In the bonding stage, you want to make your relationship public. You want some symbolic way to communicate to the world that you are officially a couple. And for some, maybe it's deciding to move in together. For others, it might be deciding to pop the question. Whatever it might be, you publicly want to communicate to the world, we are officially a couple. I had to put my glasses on there because I'm having a hard time seeing. Okay, so back to bonding. So bonding, you're officially a couple, and you want the world to know that we are one. And then during this time period, it's considered a turning point in the relationship. And so things are going really smoothly, and then there comes a point in the relationship, the next stage, moving on to the next slide here, that's differentiation. So then when we start to differentiate, and if you look over here at this figure, the stages of relational development, so the coming together we just talked about, and then relational maintenance kind of exist right here, and now the coming apart. So in the differentiation stage, what we are doing is we are starting to differentiate from the other person. You want to get your identity back. So it's no longer the we. It might sometimes be the we, but now you want to become more of yourself again. So you might have felt like, hey, I lost myself in this person. I need to find out again who I am and what I want. Differentiating is likely to occur when a relationship begins to experience the first inevitable feelings of stress. So you might have been on cloud 9 and now there's a little bit of stress. And then how are you going to handle that stress in the relationship? So you might take a step back and start to differentiate. And then moving on to the next stage, if the relationship continues to de-escalate, we come to circumscribing, and that's when the time, the quality, and the quantity of time that you spend together starts to decrease. So that time is starting to decrease. You might do things a little bit more separately from each other. You might say, oh, I'm going to take a week vacation with the girls, and your partner says, I'm going to take my week vacation with the guys, whatever it might be. And so you start to spend less and less time together. And then if that continues spiraling down, so the relationship then starts to stagnate. And when it stagnates, things just are kind of, they're in that phase where, like, the intensifying stage that is long gone, you're wondering if that will ever exist again. And there's really no growth that is occurring between you and that person. And so you're not quite sure what to do. And you can actually move back up, or you can go back down and continue to come apart. And then that brings us to avoiding. When you just want to avoid that person, you try to avoid talking to that person, you try to avoid being with that person, and then that leads us to termination. And the termination stage could last years. You might decide we're going to divorce if you happen to be married. Or you might decide, if you're not married and you're living together, I might decide to go get my own apartment or my own place. And you might still try to make it work and stay together, or you may decide to leave the relationship. Now, if the relationship is terminated, there's something called grave dressing. And grave dressing is, how do we dress the death of this relationship? And it's a narrative. So it's the story that you tell your friends about why the relationship ended. So it's the story that you tell your friends. Everyone has a narrative. Everyone has a story. So think of it like this. How do you dress your grave? So how do you dress the death of that particular relationship? And that's called grave dressing. We all do it. So what I would like you to do, I'm not going to play it, but click on the War of the Roses, the movie trailer. You might decide to use this particular film as the film that you're going to analyze. I'll talk more about that at a later date. But I want you to click on this because I've yet to find a film that perfectly illustrates each specific step of Knapp's model for the stages of relational development, of escalation and de-escalation. So I highly recommend that you watch that movie trailer, and it's quite funny. Now, what are some of the criticisms or the limitations of the developmental perspective? Well, there is too heavy a focus on the sequential movement from one stage to the next, and it ignores the idea that multiple stages may exist simultaneously. So if we go back to this figure here, if you look at this, well, you could go from differentiating back to bonding, and then back to integrating. You could go from circumscribing to differentiating back to bonding. And it's even possible to go back to that intense period of the relationship. not necessarily or literally go back, but to have similar experiences, and that the communication that you had during that stage, it is possible to go back and forth, and it is possible to experience different stages at the same time. So that's some of the criticisms of this particular, or the limitations of this particular model. Okay, moving on to our next slide. Another really perspective for how we manage our relationships, it's called dialectical tensions, dialectical perspective, dialectical theory. And there's three main tensions that we experience in relationships. And what determines the quality of our relationships is how do we manage these tensions. And tensions are when the conflict arises from two opposing, if you will, two opposing or incompatible forces. So the first one is connection versus autonomy, and this is the most popular tension, or not popular, but this is the most common tension that we have in our relationships. So someone might have a greater need to stay connected and with that person all the time. The other person might have a greater need for that independence or that self-government, or to be alone a little bit more. So that's a real common tension in relationships, and how do you manage those tensions? The next one is openness versus privacy. Now, openness, it's one person might want to communicate their personal lives to the entire world, or like to tell the person everything that they're feeling, their partner, their romantic partner. And the other person might like to be a little bit more private about things. So this is another very common tension in relationships. And then the last one is predictability versus novelty. So in relationships, we want to have a degree of predictability. We want to know what's going to happen, but we also want to have something that's new and that's fresh. So there's, again, this is another tension. Some people want greater predictability than other people. So what do we do with these tensions? How are we going to manage these tensions? Well, there's different ways to manage the dialectical tensions. The first one is denial. You can just, hey, I pretend like this doesn't exist. I want to be with this person all the time, and they like to be alone a lot of the time, and I'm just going to pretend like that does not exist. So that one does not work out too well, but it is a very commonly used way to manage the tensions that we have for connection and autonomy. But it's not the best one. It's not the most effective. Another one is disorientation. It's really when you feel so overwhelmed that you completely feel helpless. So if you get into a relationship and let's say you have this desire to share your feelings with this person, maybe in the beginning the person did share their feelings with you, and then you get together and you're together for a longer period of time, and then you realize that they like to be more private, and then you think, what the heck happened? And you're totally disoriented, and you could stay in that state for a long time, wishing that they could go back to the way that they used to be. Another one is alternation, and that's when it's a strategy. It's when you choose one end of the spectrum at some times, and then the other end of the spectrum at other times. And this can be really confusing for people. So let's say at sometimes you want to be super connected to the person, and then other times you want nothing to do with that person. So you're alternating between the two tensions. So that can be confusing for your partner. The next one is segmentation. That's another way to manage our dialectical tensions. When partners who use this tactic, what they do is compartmentalize areas of their relationship. And in your textbook on page 295, there's a cute comic that shows a stepmother speaking with her stepson. And the stepmother says, you got a detention at school and you didn't tell me. And he says, so? And she said, or then he says, there are a lot of things that I don't tell you. They look at each other and she said, such as? And he says, stupid, stupid, stupid. But the point is that what he is doing, and what we often sometimes do in our relationships, is that to manage these tensions for openness versus privacy, we segment our lives. We compartmentalize our lives, and we don't share that information with that particular person. And another strategy is balance. It's when we try to balance the dialectical tensions. We recognize that both forces are legitimate and try to manage them through compromise. And compromise doesn't work out so well. Compromise is a short-term solution to a perhaps long-term problem. and that doesn't work out too well. So it's a win-lose, win-lose when you try to balance it out. So the first 5 ways to manage dialectical tensions aren't that great. The last 3 are some of the better solutions to managing these tensions. One is integration. And in integration, we accept the opposing forces. We don't try to diminish the opposing forces. And you're accepting perhaps the predictability and the novelty of the relationship. And then you come together as a couple and you say, okay, we're going to make our relationship predictably novel. And then you have a plan. So that's one way to integrate. Another way to manage the tension more effectively is to recalibrate. And in recalibration, communicators can respond to these challenges by reframing them. So we've talked about how to reframe the way we are thinking about a situation. Well, in recalibration, we're reframing the way we're looking at a situation. So you might look at your partner who wants to be with you all the time and you don't. You might say to yourself, I'm looking at the situation in a way that isn't bringing the two of us closer together. And there's a lot that I can learn for trying to be a little bit more friendly and a little bit more loving toward my partner. So you just kind of recalibrate the way you're looking at these tensions that you have in your relationship. And then finally is reaffirmation. And this is a strategy that acknowledges that the tensions exist, that they never will disappear, and you just accept them for what they are. You understand that the metaphor for relationships can be a roller coaster, and you're in it for the long haul, and you're willing to take the ride. And sometimes it's going to be fun and exciting, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes you're going to agree, and sometimes you're going to disagree. So you're cool with that. So that's reaffirmation. So there are different ways to manage these tensions, and yes, some are a little bit better than others. And then finally, if you look here at the next slide, figure 9.2, a helical model of relational cycles. What this just demonstrates is that in all relationships, they're really cyclical. There's going to be a period where there's security. There's going to be a period of disintegration. There's going to be a period of alienation, and there's going to be a period of resynthesis, and then it continues or it doesn't. So we know that relationships are always changing. So that's one of the characteristics of relationships. We are not going to change the fact that they are always changing. So that is quite predictable. How they change is what is novel. We don't know that, but it's quite predictable that we know relationships will always change. And we also know that relationships are affected by culture. So we have all of these variables that we discussed in relationships that we've discussed in this chapter and in previous chapters. And we know that culture is another variable that will affect our relationships. And how, depending upon what culture you're from, if you're from a low context culture or high context culture, will determine how you perceive your partner's communication at times. So the example that's used in your textbook that I really like is in American culture, it's more of an individualistic culture. And in Japanese culture, we know it's a much more collectivistic culture. And one of the self-help books that they talked about, so it's just a way to kind of understand how relationships are affected by culture and affected how we perceive the situation. They use the example that in the United States, one of the things that people value is directness. And in Japan, one of the things that people value is indirectness. So there's an American self-help book, and it's titled, in America, it's titled, How to Say No Without Feeling Guilty. So in America, it's titled, How to Say No Without Feeling Guilty. And in Japan, it's titled, 16 Ways to Avoid Saying No. So same thing, but different approach. And we have to understand that culture will affect our relationships. And that doesn't mean that you don't get into a relationship, a friendship, or a romantic relationship with a person from another culture. But it does mean that you need to try to understand the culture a little bit better so that you can try to minimize some of the communication differences and misunderstandings. Moving on now to communicating about relationships. So we understand from previous chapters that in communication, there's a content aspect. That is the information that is being shared. And then the relational message, that is what you are communicating, how you feel. It announces how you feel about that person. So content and relational messages. So the types of relational messages that we have, the first one is affinity. So in affinity, that's when you have affinity for someone that's liking. It's the degree to which you appreciate another person. So you want to communicate to the person that you're in the relationship with that you like them, that you appreciate them. It's something that's important to communicate, because without communicating that to the person you're in a relationship with, sometimes people feel that they are unappreciated or underappreciated or not appreciated at all. So affinity is one type of relational message. Another one is immediacy, and that refers to the degree of interest and attention we feel toward and communicate to other people. So when I teach public speaking, I would say, as a speaker, you need to be immediate. And literally that means you need to close the gap between you and the audience. You need to show your facial expressions. You need to communicate that you're interested in what you're talking about, that you're knowledgeable about your topic, and that you care about the audience. Well, the same thing in a relationship. You want to demonstrate immediacy. You want to demonstrate to the person that you care about them, and you do that usually non-verbally. You do that through your facial expression, through your tone of voice. So we communicate to other people how important they are to us by whether or not we are being immediate with them. And respect, that is another type of relational message. Respect is one of the most important ingredients of a good relationship. So if not the most important aspect of a healthy relationship, is you have to have respect. Having respect is more important than being liked in relationships. And then the last one, the final dimension of relational communication, is control. And that's the degree to which the parties in a relationship have the power to influence one another. So does one person dominate the conversation, or does one person talk over another person? So in conversation, you want to ask yourself, does my partner talk over me? Does my partner interrupt me? So does my partner change the topic often? And that's one of the dimensions of control. And another one is decision making. Who has the power to determine what will happen in the relationship? What are we going to do Saturday night? Is it something where there's a balance between you decide maybe one weekend and your partner decides the other weekend, or does the partner always decide? Do they always have the control? So control, again, it's the degree to which both parties can influence power, control over the other. So these are all different dimensions of relational communication that are very important to understanding so that you can have a healthier relationship. And moving on to meta communication, that's communication about communication. Interestingly enough, you use your communication tools mindfully in meta communication. So sometimes you have to talk about your relationship and how your relationship is going. You have to talk about the feelings and all of that. It is necessary. So if in a relationship you avoid that all the time, that does not bode well for your relationship. So you do have to sometimes talk about your relationship and how are things going. You have to check in with each other. And it is important that you communicate not only content, what you are saying, but also non-verbally what you are communicating as well. You have to be mindful of how you communicate to that person, to your partner, non-verbally. And then moving on to maintaining interpersonal relationships. So there are strategies that help us to keep our relationships more satisfying. And within your relationship, the different relationships that you have, again, it could be friends, it could be family members, it could be your romantic partner, but you try to keep it positive. Do you try to stay positive in the relationship, the climate? Do you try to keep it upbeat? Another strategy to keeping your relationship satisfying is that level of openness, talking directly about your relationship. Do you feel like you're able to be honest with this person? And if you do, being able to have that openness is more satisfying for you and potentially the other person too. Assurances is letting the other person know both verbally and non-verbally that no matter what, you are committed to the relationship. So we all need some assurance in our relationship. So by communicating, that can help us keep our relationships more satisfying. And then social networks, they're being vested in each other's friends. It's really important. So if you're in a romantic relationship and you don't like your partner's family or you don't like your partner's friends, that's going to be a problem, because you have to be able to engage with your partner's social networks. If you don't, it long term is going to be very, very difficult for both you and your partner. So there again has to be that level of respect for a partner's friends and family. And then finally, sharing tasks. That do you like to do things together? Do you share in your daily chores, that share in the work, share in the household duties or responsibilities? You need to keep your relationship satisfying. So trying to strike a balance there. And then moving on to further maintaining our interpersonal relationships, we look at social support, and social support is about helping each other during really challenging times. And there are three main types of support resources. There's emotional support, informational support, and instrumental support. So emotional support that we offer our friends and our loved ones, our partners, during really tough times. You're there for them during stress, hurt, or grief. You can offer kind words. You can listen with empathy. You're there for that person, and you let them know that you're there for them. And you do that in part by being there physically, if possible. And you also do that by being very person-centered. So you're not taking the situation and you're bringing it back to yourself, but rather you're really focused on that person, and you are demonstrating to that person both verbally and non-verbally that you are there for them, and that you have their back, and that you can help to cushion their fall. Another one is informational support. And informational support could literally be you have friends that know where to find the good buys, and they can offer you information. Or you might have a friend that is really social, and they have all the gossip on what's going on in town, and you love to listen to it, although you don't want to take part in it. So we get informational support from our friends. And then finally, instrumental support. It's when our friends, they roll up their sleeves and they're here to help you. They're here to support you no matter what. And we can count on family members, and we can count on romantic partners, and some of our very close friends when we're in a time of need. And it made me think of instrumental support. My best friend, when my grandmother died, she drove a couple of hours. And at that point in time, I was not eating. I couldn't eat. I was grief stricken. And I just literally sat at home every day and just did nothing. And she drove all the way here to Bradenton, and she brought me a bunch of food. And I wasn't cooking because I didn't have the energy or the strength to get up and cook. And she was there, and she brought food, and it was a real simple gesture, but it meant the world to me. So she was instrumental in my recovery, if you will, from grief. So now we're getting close to the end, and you're thinking, thankfully, but we're getting close to the end here, and we're looking at other ways to maintain our interpersonal relationships, and we're looking specifically at relational transgressions. So we do have those relational transgressions, and how do we repair our damaged relationships? So how do we repair those damaged relationships? Well, what are some of the relational transgressions? Our lack of commitment. So lack of commitment could be failure to honor really important obligations. It could be cheating on your partner. It could be being dishonest with your partner. So these are ways that we break our commitment to our partner, and that is a relational transgression. Distance. So sometimes physical separation beyond what is actually necessary, or sometimes psychologically separating yourself from a person or distancing yourself from a person. There's something called stonewalling, and it's one of the worst things that you can do to a person. It's a form of psychological torture. When you stonewall a person in a relationship, you just ignore them. You pretend like they don't exist. You pretend like they're not even there. And that's one of the worst things that you can do. It's very harmful to the relationship, and it's something that you do not want to ever engage in. So distancing yourself is another relational transgression. Disrespect, it's criticism, especially in front of a third party, is a big no-no. So when you disrespect a person, let's just say, for example, there's a partner, and let's say it's a husband and wife, and the husband makes fun of his wife in front of her family or in front of her friends. that's very disrespectful, and it is a complete relational transgression. And even if the partner doesn't say anything, you need to know that that is not acceptable in a relationship, and it is going to do a great deal of harm, especially if it's long-term and it's chronic. So you want to make sure that you're respectful to your partner. Remember, going back to how important respect is, but especially in front of other people, you want to make sure that you don't do that. And then also problematic emotions that we have: jealousy, unjustified suspicion, rage. Rage is never good. Anger can be productive in some instances, but rage, there's nothing good about it. So those are really problematic emotions. And then finally, aggression, that's the verbal hostility and physical violence that is absolutely unacceptable in a relationship. It is a complete relational transgression. So what do we do about these things? We need to understand, are they minor or are they significant? So when you're trying to evaluate, do I stay with this person? Do I maintain this friendship? Do I not maintain this romantic relationship? In this family, am I going to continue to break bread with this person? Well, only you know that. And there are some things that you want to consider. Is this minor or is this really significant? Is this social? Or when we're talking about social rules, are these violations that have violated social rules in society? Or did this person violate our relational rules? And does that matter to you? Was it deliberate or was it unintentional? Maybe your partner did disrespect you, but maybe they didn't really mean to. They didn't realize it. So you want to take that into consideration. And also, was it a one-time or was it incremental? Maybe your partner had a blow-up out in public, and maybe it was just a one-time thing, but is it happening chronically? Is it happening often? So these are all questions that you have to ask yourself to determine if this is worthy of forgiveness, if you want to stay in the relationship and work on it, or if you want to move on. So some of the strategies for relational repair is, let's say you have transgressed in the relationship, and then how are you going to try to repair it? So there are some ways. Remember, this is our communication toolkit that we can engage in to repair the relationship to the best of our ability. So number one, you can express regret, truly saying, I am sorry, I feel really bad about what I did. So you're expressing that regret, you're being honest with how you feel. Number two, it's so important to accept responsibility. If you try to be defensive, or if you try to shift the blame to someone else, that does not bode well for committing a transgression and for forgiveness. So by accepting responsibility, you are saying, I understand I did this and I am sorry for this. I take full responsibility. Another one is making restitution. That's when you say, I know I did wrong. What can I do to make it right? So how can I make this up to you? Number four is genuinely repenting. So I will do my best never to do this again. And with all sincerity, I will do my best. And then finally, you can also request forgiveness. And literally you're asking, will you forgive me? So you have repented, you're going to make restitution, and then you're ultimately requesting forgiveness from that person that you have committed a transgression against. And then the person who is responding to the transgression, there's a few different ways they can handle it. They can accept it. They can say, I'm glad you understand the gravity of what you did, and I forgive you. They might say, I can't let this one go. This is something that I'm not going to be able to get over. So they might reject you, and they might not be able to ever forgive you. And then the third one is discussion, and that's going back into your communication toolkit. Once you ask for forgiveness, that might trigger a discussion, because perhaps the person might feel that you don't fully understand the gravity of your actions. So that might encourage or spark a discussion. And then how you handle that discussion is going to be very important. That's why you want to have your communication toolkit ready. So moving on to our final slide, you thought it would never come, the day would never come that we would actually finish this chapter, but we covered a lot today. The factors that influence your choice of relational partners, Knapp's model of relational stages. We talked about dialectical tensions and managing those tensions, change in culture and interpersonal relationships, metacommunication, and then the steps necessary to maintain, support, and repair interpersonal relationships. And moving on to our final slide, I leave you with a quote from Rumi, who is one of my favorite poets. And Rumi says, "Here is a relationship booster that is guaranteed to work. Every time your spouse or lover says something stupid, make your eyes light up as if you just heard something brilliant." And I think that is something that we all should aspire to living. I don't always live by it. You probably don't always live by it. And it's not just your spouse or your lover, but if you have a child, every time the child comes in the room and your eyes just light up, lets that child know that they are seen and they are loved. We forget to do that often in our lives. And Rumi just kind of really touches on something that if we were all a little bit more loving and we demonstrated that in our actions, that our relationships might just be a little bit better in our lives. And that's what we all want. We want to have relationships that are healthy and that are joyful, because without those relationships in our lives, our life really doesn't have the quality, and our life really isn't as exciting and fantastic and as lovely as it can possibly be.